It's great to see that many of you are already back inside. We would like now to follow up with Alexander Knohl, Professor for Bioclimatology at Göttingen University, with Holger Kreft, Professor for Biodiversity and Macroecology at the University of Göttingen, with Maike Wolny, Professor of Environmental and Resource Economics at the Göttingen University, and with Arjen Tjoa from the Agriculture Faculty of the University of Indonesia in Jambi, who will be with us from remote. I can see her already on the small screen. Hi, Arjen. Nice to have you with us as well. All of the named are responsible for the Collaborative Research Center 990 and have prepared a presentation for us today with the title Ecological and Socioeconomic Functions of Tropical Lowland Rainforest Transformation Systems. They will explain exactly what this is about. And we have been in touch since many months, also already together with Siko Keluang. And during the next hours, we all learn more what this project is about. And I'm looking forward to listen to you and give the stage now. It's all yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Andrea. It's a great pleasure for us to be here today. We are Maike, Holger, Alexander, and Arjen joining us here from Trøndelag University. Great to see you, Arjen. And we would like to thank the documenta team, ruangrupa, and also our friends from Siko Keluang for this really exciting endeavor, starting an art-science collaboration. That is new for us. We are scientists, and that is really exciting. And now we would like to bring you to Jambi, to our projects. We call it efforts, ecological and socioeconomic functions of tropical lowland rainforest transformation systems. We are a consortium, an Indonesian-German consortium of 4 universities. Bogo Agricultural University, Jambi University, and Tadulako University, and the University of Göttingen. Our research is based in Jambi. What you see here is a drone video from the Harapan rainforest. It's a conservation concession area, and it is considered to be among the most diverse tropical rainforests in Southeast Asia. It's home to about 300 different bird species, provides habitats to the Sumatran taiga and the Sumatran elephant. It also contains a lot of carbon. We have tall trees. And this landscape has now been converted. Driven by a global demand for cheap vegetable oil, big parts of the existing or previously existing tropical rainforest in the lowlands of Sumatra has been converted to oil palm plantations. Palm oil is a very interesting commodity because it grows very efficiently. It produces more vegetable oil per hectare, 4 times more than any other vegetable oil. It also can be processed in many different ways so that it ends up in food, cosmetics, biofuels. So there are a wide range of applications. But you can also see by just comparing these pictures what the impact is on structure, biodiversity, landscape. To illustrate this point, I would like to show you the map of land transformation from the 1985 to 2007. Sumatra used to be covered for about 70% by rainforest, and now only 4% of that original area remains in the lowlands. And particularly in the lowlands, most of the remaining forests are conservation areas, national parks or conservation concession areas. The oil palm plantations are driven or operated by smallholders and large-scale commercial plantations in the province of Jambi, about 50-50%. Well, the overall goal of our project is to understand ecological and socioeconomic functions of these land use systems and to look into trade-offs between forest, yeah, and then the converted land where humans are using the oil palm to make the livelihoods. And what we aim for is to see if we can explore ways how to reconcile conservation and human needs. So again, I hand over to you.
This chance to introduce everybody to our consortium, so that as mentioned by Professor Alexander Knoll, that the CRC, perhaps somebody can move the slide. So the consortium, an international consortium between the two countries, between Indonesia and Germany, and is funded by the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft. The location of the research is in Sumatra. It is in the western part of the Indonesia. So that the main partners from the Germany is the University of Göttingen, where our main office are located, and it's also the main speakers are from the University of Göttingen, which is who is represented by Professor Dr. Stefan Sois, and the Indonesian partners, as has been mentioned, consists of 3 universities, IPB University and the University of Jambi. Surely it's located in Jambi in the research area, and the Tadulako University. We also have 2 branches of the offices here to manage the managements, and representing by one of the spokespersons. And at the moment is from the IPB University, the spokesperson. We successfully conducted the 2 phase of the project. So totally we have 3 phases of the project, and the first and the second phases. So from the 2012 till the 2019 has been completed, successfully completed. And now we are, since last year, we are starting the third phase, or will be also the last phase of the project. So next slide, please. And because this is a 2 countries research project between Indonesia and the Germany partnership. Beside that, we also in our research project having a lot of subgroup or sub-project, so that we for a better management system to be more productive with the output, as well as efficient in using resources. We have 4 boards in total. So the first board is the joint management board between the 4 universities together. So such as Alexander Knoll, Professor Alexander Knoll is also representing one of the members of the joint management board, as well as me from the Tadulako University of the member of the joint management board. So that the joint management board is the board that let's say, to decide or to lead the management system of the collaborations. And the second board is about the publication board. The publication board is mainly manage the openness of the publication, so that the openness as well as the sharing between subgroup, so that the publication before published has been announced first within the partnership members, so that others subgroup can join or would like to share the data, whatever. So that and the third board in our management system is the data management board, which is dealing with the data collection within the project of the CRC, as well as to organize the access and the sharing and the reuse within the subgroup in the project. And last but not least is the conventional biological diversity, or also known as the Nagoya Protocol, because the CRC 990 projects are dealing with the biological material, so that we are working on 2 different countries with the own regulations, particular regulation in each country. So we are with the board of the Convention Biological Diversity, we are trying to work on a compatible regulation within the 2 countries. And not only in the legal identity or the legal signs between the 2 countries in the high level, like the MOU and MOA, but within the research itself, so in the sub-project, that signing also a counterpart agreement. So between the Indonesian parties and the Göttingen researchers have the agreements. So every of the sub-project have signed the counterpart agreement. We are one of the very successful project, I would say, in Indonesia, because we produce quite high of output of the project. So most of the paper is a peer review, and very happy also to introduce that the 80% of the publication are with the Indonesian co-authorship. We produce also master thesis, dissertation, and beside that also having a lot of exchange lectures, in particular in Indonesia, guest lecture from our partners in Göttingen, and laboratory training, workshop in Indonesia. But we will not only concentrate on the peer review papers, but it's also producing policy brief, cartoon books, dissemination of the finding of our research result, training and capacity development program for our stakeholders here. And we also produce some of the identification key book, which is free download, can be used by many other parties openly. So next slide, please.
Yeah, so this would also then bring us to the design where we do the research. And as mentioned before, we're interested in this transition between different land use types. So we study tropical rainforest, but also then oil palm plantation, and additionally rubber plantations, and then jungle rubber. That is an old agroforestry system where individual trees were taken out and replaced by rubber trees within a forest. And this all follows a quite strict experimental design where we co-locate ecological and socioeconomic research in the same locations. So we have within the province of Jambi, we have two main landscapes. We call them the Harapan landscape and the Bukit Dua Belas landscape. And here we have core plots where like the biodiversity people go with their measurements, we go with our climate data, climate measurements, we go all to the same plots and we measure things in place. And then the surrounding villages are investigated by the socioeconomic groups so that we can really collocate data from ecology and socioeconomic in these regions. If you want to learn more about the experiment, the field work, I invite you to join later our presentation that we have at the lunch break. There is a big smart board and you can join on a virtual tour through some of the field work. Yeah? So you're all invited to join, and Christian, Dienda, and Martina sitting over there, they will guide you through that landscape. Well, in this landscape, we also have people, of course, living. And this is very interesting also for our project, and Ayan will continue here.
Yeah, so because we are working in the village, not located in one area, so in the different part, majorly two big parts of the Jambi province. And the locals, the villages can be grouped in three types of villages. So that village consists of local or some indigenous, so local tribe. We also having working in the village with the mixed tribes, so local and transmigrant, and all village only consists of transmigrants. So transmigrants means that it is actually people that move from high populated area to less populated area within the Indonesian territory. Yeah, so they are Indonesian, mainly from Java, and moved to Sumatra, to the less populated long time ago. But nowadays Sumatra is also well high populated. So, and not only difference in the villages level, so we are working also with level from Dusun village. So Dusun is a small village until sub-district, district, and in profession level. And in our group, in the CRC 990, we're also working with many stakeholders in the national level and some institution in international level, usually with a very high numbers of members, as well as different villages type and different governmental body structure as our stakeholders, surely that we build a communication, understanding, and many interaction with our partners. And we also trying to build and efficient supporting system then for our research. Next slide.
So now you got an overview of the activities that we do over there, and now let's start with the fieldwork. Yeah, so Syria, for example, up here is looking into a sediment core. Here some soil samples are taken. Here there's some discussions with the local village people about what kind of trees could be planted to in which oil palm plantations. And here's meetings with a tribe in an area. So we combine all these different measurements and interactions with the local population, and we need to share knowledge, because only with the combined expertise from the local population, for example, here Island is a tree spotter from this region, together with Fabian, who will later talk, and he's sitting over there. They are spotting trees, identifying tree species, and then there's a student from the local university that is learning about these trees over there. Fieldwork can also be challenging. Some of the sites are quite remote. We have to carry in equipment for hours. Yeah? And depending on the season, the roads, the pathways are easier to access or more difficult. And then capacity building and outreach to students, university students, or high school students. Clara is talking to some high school students. That is very important for our project. So what did we find? Well, I mentioned carbon already before. There's a lot of carbon stored in the tropical rainforest when you look here to the left side of the road, and then it's converted to oil palm plantation. And this is what we see in the data. This is the carbon pool of the forest compared to now the oil palm plantations, and we see it declines by about 60%. So there's a dramatic loss in carbon stored on land. It's mainly driven by the above ground biomass, to a smaller extent also by the soils. Interestingly, the oil palm plantations are highly productive. They're heavily fertilized, so they produce, they make a lot of photosynthesis, but most of that photosynthetic assimilates are exported via harvest, so that at the end, little carbon really stays on site. We then looked into greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah, we built a flux tower here in one of the plantations, and at that tower we measure up and down moving air parcels, and can then infer the amount of CO2 being absorbed, the amount of nitrous oxide, another important greenhouse gas that is emitted. And when we sum that all up, we see that the oil palm plantation is actually a source for greenhouse gases. There is a strong net uptake driven by the high rate of fertilization, but because most of that carbon is exported, and additionally we get nitrous oxide, which is a very potent greenhouse gas, as emission, we end up with a net source of CO2, of greenhouse gases. And then finally, we also looked into surface temperatures, combining measurements with small meteo stations, but also satellite data. We can see that in comparison to the forest, converted land, bare soil is much hotter, 10 degrees warmer. Young oil plantations also clearly warmer, 6 degrees warmer. But then when the oil palms become older, they approach the forest, and it's only slightly warmer. So at the landscape level, we could show that there has been an increase in surface temperatures beyond the normal global warming that is happening at the global scale. So there was an additional warming because of the land surface temperature, the land use changes. So this was the overview of some of these environmental impacts, but there are also impacts on biodiversity. Holger.
Thank you. So I would like to show again a picture of the rainforests of Sumatra that once covered the entire lowlands. They're among the most diverse and most complex ecosystems that we know on Earth. Just to give you a number, on a single hectare to soccer fields, we may find around 250 different tree species. On that tiny area, more tree species than we have in entire Europe. So they're very complex, very diverse. To give you an idea about the wildlife that we find there, they're home of iconic species that you see here pictured, such as the famous orangutans, other primates, gibbons, forest elephants, hornbills, sun bears, and the Sumatran tiger. And all of these species that you see here are globally threatened by extinction due to this ongoing and large-scale forest loss. Some more impressions about the native forest biodiversity. That is our group of organisms that we like most. We study plants, trees, and so on, and I hope you can maybe share the beautiful impressions of the flora of Sumatra. So we're conducting biodiversity inventories. They're quite challenging because you have so many species. You need to put a name on them and identify them to the species. But a lot of species that we find are actually new to science, and you see some examples here, some spiders, some plants, centipedes, and so on that were unknown to scientists before we started this project. Some further impressions from the field. As Alexander already outlined, it's quite strenuous and complicated to work there under these conditions. It's raining, it's very hard work, but then you have the chance to experience the beautiful tropical biodiversity. I would also like to show a couple of results. We see massive changes in key ecosystem variables. So if we go from forest, you have the land use change from the left to the right, from the native vegetation to the agroforest system, more traditional extensive system, to the intensively managed plantations. We see a simplification in ecosystem structure. They're losing carbon, they're losing in height, and they become very homogeneous because they're all these crop trees are all of the same age. What happens with biodiversity with these massive changes? We see a sharp decline again along the same gradient from forest, which are characterized by this high diversity that I already pointed out. Agroforests have an intermediate position, and then we see dramatic losses across these different groups, from bacteria to birds. Basically, we cover a full range of different taxonomic groups. So at the local scale of our study plots, we see these dramatic losses. We're also seeing other changes in biodiversity. The communities, so the plants and animals that live together, they change in composition. So we're not only losing species, but the species that remain are different, or the communities are different. That's illustrated here in this rather complicated graph, but we have our forest plots in dark green on the left side, and they're very distinct, particularly from the plantations, which are shown in yellow and red on the right-hand side. We also have among the species winners and losers. Among the losers, we have forest-dependent species. That probably does not come as a surprise. If we sum up all of the species that we encountered, most of them are forest specialists. We would never find them outside of the forest because they cannot tolerate the climatic conditions outside, or they cannot find food and shelter there. And there's a strong conservation message, of course, in there. So we can only protect these species in forests, so we need to have effective protected areas. The second largest bar here are generalist species. They occur inside of the forest, but also in the agricultural landscape. And again, there's an option here, or a management implication, so we might have a chance to protect these species also in the agricultural landscape if we manage the lands in a wildlife-friendly way. And then on the more right-hand side, we have what we call agricultural specialists, very often weedy species that come in. Very often they're also not native to Sumatra, but imported from other tropical continents, so quite severe shifts. To sum up this part, you have seen this photo before, rainforest on the left side and the oil palm plantation on the right. And these flower diagrams now summarize a lot of different variables that we looked at, and the length of these petals show you how well these functions are represented. And you see inside of the forest, you have a lot of variables represented quite nicely, related to climate, to soil fertility, and so on. And we're losing a lot of these functions if we go into the plantation. But as everybody knows, there's one petal that gains in importance, which is the harvested biomass, the oil palm fruits that we take out of the system.
Okay.
With that, I hand over to Maike.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's this really impressive spike in harvested biomass that is representing the oil fruit that are harvested from the oil palms, and that are, of course, the economic motivation behind the expansion of oil palms. So now when we think about oil palm expansion, in the public debate, what is usually very much discussed is the role of large-scale companies, and that is very important, but what is maybe less mentioned or less focused on is also the role of smallholder farmers. So here we can see how oil palm expanded in Indonesia between 1990 and 2015, and we can see that both large-scale companies, represented here by the blue line, as well as smallholder farmers, represented by the green line, were driving this expansion. This was also represented or reflected in our survey data that we collected in the project of smallholder farmers. We found that the share of farm households growing oil palm increased from 37% in 2012 to 47% in 2018. So reflecting that smallholder farmers are also important actors in the expansion of oil palms. Now, again, this decision of smallholder farmers to switch to oil palm is, of course, highly economically motivated. So there are strong economic incentives to do that. And this is what is shown in our data, where we find that among oil palm growing households, household income is 13% higher compared to the other households in the area. Also, their families benefit from higher levels of consumption, as well as better nutrition and improved housing conditions. And their villages benefit from better infrastructure, including, for example, paved roads, as well as electricity. Also, schools were built in those villages. And this is reflected in this graph on the left here, which shows the poverty rates in different types of villages, where we find that in oil palm-based villages, represented by the red bars, poverty rates were much lower, about 8%, compared to villages based on rubber or villages without much cash crops, where poverty rates were around 14 and 20%. Now, this is driven by farm households who, of course, benefit from the better household incomes, but it also trickles down to non-farm households, as we can see here. So also among the non-farm households in the oil palm villages, poverty rates are lower. So this also shows how important this economic incentives is for smallholder farmers, and that it's important to keep this in mind when discussing alternatives and when discussing how to create a more sustainable oil palm system. Now, we also found potentially adverse effects on livelihoods. This has also been discussed in public debates. For example, if we consider here the distribution of farm labor, we can see first of all, and this is a peculiarity, of course, about our research area, rubber was the main cash crop that was there before oil palm, and now many households switch from rubber to oil palm. There's also other households who take up cash crops, so they didn't have rubber before, but a lot of the rubber land is converted into oil palm, and we see that oil palm is much less labor intense compared to rubber, which means that both men and women can reduce their labor, their work on farm, but this is overproportionately so for female workers, because the tasks are often more strenuous and women are less engaged in on-farm labor. So the question is then, what does that mean for gender roles? And in our research, we found that women, in fact, spend more time with traditional household chores and also have less control over the allocation of farm income. And that, of course, raises important concerns about female empowerment. Also, more generally, we found that access to benefits is unequally distributed. So different households have access to land or to different degrees, as well as to credit, for example. And this, of course, then determines also how the benefits are distributed. Land rights are often contested, they are ambiguous, and that sparks local conflict. And also we have seen in the previous presentations that ecosystem services and functions are reduced as a result of the oil palm expansion, and to what extent households are affected also differs among households.
Okay, so what we talked about so far is a classical trade-off. So we were able to show in the past years these losses of biodiversity and ecosystem functions along a gradient of land use intensity. That's the red line. We're losing these functions. And on the other hand, we have the yellow function, a gain in economic functions that Michael talked about. And so the question is now, is this always the case? Is this a Gordian knot that we cannot solve, or do we have options to improve? And here is where restoration comes in. So the basic question is, can we somehow push on the right-hand side this red line up so that we avoid this trade-off? And we're in the middle of the United Nations decade of ecosystem restoration. To address this, we set up two experiments inside of oil palm plantations. And the one is a management experiment where we looked especially at the fertilizer application and the use of herbicides or mechanical weed management. So this is a view of a conventionally managed oil palm plantation. You see the oil palm trunks there, and you also maybe spot these brown circles around the oil palms. That's where the farmers or workers apply the fertilizers on a regular basis in quite huge amounts. And you also see that the green understory is rather short. So this is intensively managed weed control either by herbicides or by mechanical weeding. So we changed that or manipulated that experimentally. We reduced the amount of fertilizers experimentally to a level where the soil scientists say that is actually even with the amount of nutrients that we take out of the system. And we changed the weed management from herbicides to mechanical. On the right-hand side, I mean, what we first saw with this extensification, we see a gain in biodiversity. Biodiversity comes back, even if you go on with a quite intensive management. And by changing to a more extensive management regime, we are able actually to gain profits. That's shown here. The treatment without herbicides, where farmers do mechanical weeding, they can use less fertilizers, and they still can have a higher profit because they don't have to spend money on these agrochemicals. So that is very promising. Another experiment that we set up is a so-called biodiversity enrichment experiment. So we are in this monoculture of conventional oil palm plantations, and we asked ourselves, what happens actually if you plant native trees inside of an oil palm plantation? Back 10 years ago, the answer would have been among smallholders and oil palm people, oil palms will die immediately, they cannot coexist. not possible. So we did exactly that. We planted native trees that are of use and value to the local people. We planted valuable timber species such as meranti, fruit trees, and other species. This photo is giving you an aerial view on how this enriched oil palm plantation looks like. You see in the center the canopy of an oil palm, and around that the trees that we planted around 8 years ago. And what we can see is that on the right-hand side, the green ellipsoid basically shows you the gain of different ecological indicators that we looked at. We can still maintain pretty high yields, and farmers would have an option to also diversify their portfolio by planting other tree species and crop species. And that is also very motivating, and that brings us to Maike's last part.
Thank you. Yeah, so our biodiversity enrichment experiment was set up in a large-scale plantation, but as we saw, smallholder farmers are also important actors in the oil palm expansion. So we wondered how to foster biodiversity enrichment in a smallholder context. And in our research, we developed and tested 2 different support mechanisms. In the first support measure, we provided information in order to increase farmers' awareness and knowledge about native tree planting in oil palm plantations. And we did so using a comic that was designed by a local artist. And in a second support measure, we combined this knowledge with the provision of free native tree seedlings to the farmers in order to reduce their cost. And we found that both of these support measures were effective in increasing the share of farmers planting native trees in and around their oil palm plantations. We can see from this graph in the middle that the second measure that combines information with seedling provision was much more effective, so rising the percentage by 38%. So this indicates that this provision of high-quality tree seedlings is really critical. We found in our discussions that access in the local villages is very much restricted, and for farmers it's very difficult to access seedling material of native trees. We also did some follow-up research to see whether it's really the free provision or provision of seedlings at a small cost. And there we actually didn't see much of a difference. So farmers were willing to pay for the seedlings. They had a high interest in these native tree seedlings, but at an affordable cost. So oftentimes their willingness to pay was below the local market prices, which were very high due to the small quantities being traded and offered in the villages. So based on the knowledge that we have gained so far, and also realizing that just planting trees is not enough, we want to develop this sustainable village project together with the documenta, where the goal is to explore pathways to transform oil palm monocultures into ecologically valuable but also economically viable landscapes that serve the community. So the core of this project is a participatory bottom-up approach where the community engages in planning their landscape and their livelihoods. So this community-led planning process will be kickstarted by an art science festival. We will hear more about this later. Siko Keluang and Fabian Brambach, who are sitting here, they will talk about this and tell us a little bit more about their approach. And then in sequence to this Art Science Festival, we will have 2 moderators that will engage with the community. They will support the community in defining their goals and priorities based on the local knowledge in that village, but also potentially providing capacity building on demand. So an aspect, for example, of external knowledge that could be brought in is related to the diversification or enrichment of oil palm plantations, where we would share the knowledge generated in the CRC, in our research project. Another important aspect is the diversification of the related value chain. So this could relate, for example, to establishing local village-based nurseries for native trees, for native tree seedlings. It could also involve local initiatives to process tree-based products, for example, based on wood or fruits. Because we realize that agricultural diversification can only be sustainable if we take the whole value chain into account and also think about viable livelihoods in this context. It's important to emphasize that this project has a very experimental character, which means that we cannot clearly define the outcomes ex ante, so before the implementation of the project. We will document the lessons learned, and we will also engage in outreach activities. An outreach program, we have already a long-standing experience now collaborating with the University of Jambi, who will lead this outreach program, targeting other local villages, but also local schools, for example, as well as the general public. And with this, we have provided you a short overview of some of the activities from our research project and the plans for the sustainability project. I hope you enjoyed it. If you are interested to get more details, as Alexander mentioned, there will be the virtual tour that can be visited during the lunch break. And with this, I hand over back to Andrea. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was super interesting, and it gave insights in all aspects, from your general research until the project that we are doing together now in the framework of Documenta 15. As we have done it in the morning hours already, I would like to actually also open up to the audience if there are any questions you might have already now that you would like to ask the three, then we do this right away. All the four, actually. Excuse me, Ayen. There you are again. And but all of you will be in the panel discussion later on as well.
Hi, thank you so much. I just had one question for this colleague. Sorry, I don't remember your name. You mentioned that the plantations were very productive in capturing, I guess, CO2 from the atmosphere, or carbon from the atmosphere, but that it didn't stay on site, and that was seen as a problem in how you presented it. Could you say more about why that's important? I mean, I understand that's not the only aspect that you're measuring, so you're also measuring biodiversity and things like this, but I mean, as far as I sort of understand, like, as long as it's being captured from the atmosphere, like, it's not, it's staying on the planet somehow. So how does that, does that make sense?
Yes, thanks for this question. I'm happy to get into that. Well, CO2 is a major greenhouse gas. It's actually the most important anthropogenic greenhouse gases. Just the IPCC just a few weeks ago released a report showing how important or what the contribution of CO2 in the atmosphere for warming is. So we need to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, and it has to go somewhere. And if we compare now, just by looking into the budgets, if we compare an open land or a plantation with a rainforest, there's just more carbon being stored in the rainforest, and that means it's not in the atmosphere. So just by comparing these two land surfaces, you can really see that that is CO2 that has been removed somewhere else. Of course, there's internal cycling, and you can argue that some of the harvest products actually will return quite quickly back to the atmosphere. If it goes into food, 70% goes into food. If we consume it, it will go back into the atmosphere. So it doesn't stay away from the atmosphere. And this is why it's good to have ecosystems storing a lot of carbon, because they remove them from the atmosphere.
Most of the oil palm plantation and rubber plantations are owned by big companies. Do you involve them, and how is their response with a view of the obvious recommendations which coming out of your research?
Can you talk about
about 60% of the oil palm plantations are big companies, but that means 40% are smallholder owned. And rubber, I think it's even a higher percentage of smallholder plots. And we focus mostly with our research on smallholders, because they're more interesting also from a socioeconomic point of view. I mean, as scientists, our main output are our scientific publications first, but we hope that we also, and there our Indonesian counterparts also come in, because they have their networks in the country and with these companies, and can disseminate results. But it has to be clear that we mostly work with smallholders.
I thought you would talk about our collaboration also for the experiments. So we have to interact with some of the companies in order to get land to conduct experiments, for example, and they were very interested to do that and to collaborate. And to actually take up the system of biodiversity enrichment. In terms of the research, so that's more almost like an outreach component, right? In terms of the research, we haven't in the past, in the first 2 phases, I would say, focused on the large-scale companies, but rather on the smallholder farmers. In this last phase of our research project, we have started to also interview some of the companies, but it is in fact very hard to get to them. So to conduct interviews has not been so easy. A lot of the research, so the objective of the research was to bring together economic and or socioeconomic and environmental and ecological functions. And in order to bring this data together, as Alexander showed, we had a research design that basically was collecting data at the same unit. And in order to do that, we needed a large number of observations, which naturally led us to work with smallholder farmers. And even the ecological plots where we look at the effects, they are smallholder managed.
Thank you so much. So I was wondering, maybe it's a silly question, but why there? There's, we are seeing everywhere in the world and on the planet severe intensification of, monocultural plantation. So why you picked Indonesia, and what the next steps are? Like, is it going to be a model? Then you plan to expand on the Amazon or, wherever another kind of monoculture exists. And also, you're evaluating the kind of small frame, temporal frame, but we know the evolution takes a way longer to measure. Like, new species can be generated also because, diversification of a forest is growing. So how can we measure, like a longer, that goes beyond our lifetime?
Yeah, so maybe there are 2 answers to that. Why are we as a consortium in Indonesia? This is because we have had long-term collaborations with Indonesian colleagues. Göttingen University with forestry and agriculture had for decades, going back to the 60s, collaboration with IPB, Boga Agricultural University. We had a big project with Tadulako University. IN was involved in that, where we had field work in Sulawesi. So there has been a very long collaboration. And this kind of research can only be done if we have collaboration, because we need so much interaction of us with people in Indonesia, expert knowledge from Indonesian side. So that is a key prerequisite for a successful project. And the scientific reason is that Indonesia is a hotspot for biodiversity, and it's a hotspot for land use change. And at the moment, Indonesia and Malaysia, I think they produce 90% of the global oil palm export or production. So that is really the key area to look into that. And Jambi province itself is interesting because it is a landscape that has already been converted. So we want to understand why this happened, how this happened, what are the impacts. And now we see in other parts of Indonesia, in Kalimantan, Borneo Island, and also in Papua starting, we see beginning changes, and a little bit the hope is that what we learn here can now serve as lessons or provide tools, information that can mitigate some of the upcoming effects that we expect to see in the future.
Maybe one quick addition to that evolutionary question at the end. Can evolution somehow provide species that we have lost? That was basically the question. You have to consider that the biodiversity there is the product of millions and millions and millions of years of evolution, and we're losing that within decades. And we're not in Jurassic Park or anything. This will not come back in a life, but let's say at a time scale that is relevant for humans. There are, of course, species are adapting. They're also changing genetically and adapting conditions. But if you lose a Sumatran tiger, this is a result of millions of years, and this will never come back.
Thank you. I have a question to Maike, perhaps. Once these agroforestry systems are established, do you have to provide or gain or raise the knowledge how to manage these forest systems or agroforestry systems, or is this knowledge already there? Because people have been managing their forest for, I don't know, years or something, or have experiences from other agroforestry systems.
Experiences from other agroforestry systems are there because jungle rubber, so-called jungle rubber, is an agroforestry system that includes rubber. But with oil palm, that has not been practiced in the research area, and even more so, I mean, in our research area, oil palm was introduced through transmigration programs and NES schemes, so nucleus estate and smallholder schemes, where often a company was set up and surrounding smallholder farmers, usually within the transmigrant program, they would get like 2 hectares of oil palm that is already established, and that over 20 years or so they would have to pay back the credit to either the government or the company. And in those contexts, it was discouraged to have any other trees growing in the oil palm. And that's also why when we started to talk to farmers about the option of intercropping or having native trees in their oil palm plantations, many of them were very reluctant because they said it's not possible, as I think Alexander mentioned that. So in that sense, it's a little bit learning by doing. So we have the experiment that we have also started to show to farmers in the area and to local schools. There is also other researchers, for example, from the Netherlands, from Wageningen University, that have been looking at alley cropping, so where you have a row of oil palm and a row of something else. So there are options, there are first experiences out there, but I think it is very important at this stage to really, there's no clear system, this is how it needs to be done, but it's a bit of a learning by doing and gaining experiences.
Ich möchte gerne auf Deutsch sprechen, da fühle ich mich etwas wohler.
So I would like to speak in German because it's easier to me. Well, thank you very much for getting us to know more about this complex context. You said this is a scientific project that you're conducting. Yes, and I would like to know about your role with Documenta 15. So the new experiences that you have harnessed, what are they?
So thanks. Is it okay wenn ich auf Englisch antworte? So thanks a lot for your questions about what we gain from this experience, this art-science interaction. Well, we are just at the beginning, to start. But one thing that follows through basically this collaboration is the term practice. In art, people do practice art, how they work on practice, and that is an interesting experience with ecological. And in science, we also have our specific practice. And for me personally, what I'm really excited about is to see how art is created out of, let's say, context, out of an environmental, societal context. And something similar is also what I see here in science, that we have our specific ways how we do science. And now finding similarities, but also finding differences is something that I'm looking forward very much to learn from the artist. I think it will be a challenge in some ways because we talk different languages, so we have to find languages, but it will also be extremely fruitful to learn in that respect from each other, and then also to engage with the public, to bring what we elaborate together to the public, that people can participate in these two different ways of practice and how they meet.